Now available in paperback and e-readers, E-Steam Ascension, The Devil's Dealer reaches a turning point in the life of this powerful E-Steam series story. Get E-Steam Ascension at online booksellers today. Legendary comic book artist George Perez told everyone on social media that he has stage 3 pancreatic cancer. And according to doctors, this cancer is inoperable, and they have given Mr. Perez only 6 months to live. Now, when I heard this news, I was absolutely devastated because George Perez's comics were a major part of my life. It was his run of Avengers from the 1970s that I learned how to read when I was 4 years old. I remember my brother sharing those comics with me, and it was those comics that led to me having a lifelong love of comic books and a lifelong love of this whole comic book medium. Now, George Perez was one of the masters of the craft of the comic book medium, and he never had any sort of formal training from any art school. No, he just submitted some samples and then he started working at Marvel. And his work at Marvel was the start of one of the greatest careers in the comic book medium. Your George Perez, as I see it, was revolutionary as related to the art form of comics, and his whole approach to comic storytelling is just absolutely breathtaking when you see it. Now, your George Perez was the artist who introduced the whole idea of these incredibly realistic shots as related to the action and adventure going on in a comic book. His scenes were often featuring this vivid and incredible detail, down to even the smallest shards of glass that were shattered inside of an action scene. That's how incredibly detailed George's art was, and when you looked at his superheroes, they were practically larger than life, and there is nothing like a George Perez comic out there. Whenever you look at his art, it is just incredible to look at because George Perez would just, again, put so much vivid detail into his scenes that you felt like you were looking at a photograph. So, whenever you would look at a George Perez comic, it wasn't just a comic book, it was an experience. And whenever you saw George's work on a cover or you saw it in as related to him working on it, you just had to go out here and pick it up off the newsstand. And I was blessed to actually experience George Perez's art in floppy comics that were a part of my brother's comic collection. Now, my brother, he bought a lot of those George Perez comics that, like the Avengers run he did in the late 70s, straight off the newsstand. And he also bought other George Perez books, like the Fantastic Four run that is extremely underrated that Mr. Perez has done, and other books that he has done, like your Marvel Team. I think it was Marvel 2-in-1. I have one of those books that inspired E-Steam Blast from the Past, that 50th issue, that cover that's just absolutely fantastic, featuring the Thing versus the Thing from the past, and the work that he did on those books, again, from the late 70s, is just absolutely amazing. And there's just so many great stories that George did for Marvel, like the Bride of Ultron storyline, the Squadron Supreme storyline before that one, and the storylines that featured the Taskmaster. All of these are legendary stories that feature legendary art from one of the great masters of the comic medium, George Perez. And I can also talk about the Fantastic Four run, which features some of the, again, most fantastic art you will ever feature with Marvel's first family. Now, George didn't also just work for Marvel, even though he started there. He also did some amazing work over at DC Comics, and I also have some of those books in my collection. I'm glad to just have the floppy versions and experience them, because his Justice League from the 70s it's just absolutely an amazing experience, because again, it feels like a big budget action movie crammed in 32 pages. And one of my favorite books that George did was Justice League 200. When my brother brought that to me in 1989, I practically read that book from cover to cover to the point where the cover fell off, and now I've got to go out here and try to find another Justice League 200 before the price shoots through the roof, because that the art on that book is again absolutely amazing, and that was all part of his start at DC, because George worked at DC just as he was working at Marvel about the same time, I think about 79, 80, and then he moved full time over to DC, where he started his legendary career on the New Teen Titans. Now, the New Teen Titans was a book that he teamed up with legendary writer Marv Wolfman to revamp the team, and he created several characters working alongside Marv, such as Cyborg, Deathstroke the Terminator, and I think he did Raven and Starfire as well. And over at Marvel, George did help create the Taskmaster, and as he was creating those legendary stories on the Avengers, and he needs to be given credit for creating some of the most iconic characters in Marvel and DC Comics. Like I said before, Cyborg, who is a major character in the DC universe, Raven and Starfire, Deathstroke the Terminator, considered to be one of DC's greatest villains to come out of the 80s, and he also helped to create Nightwing, which helped Robin transition from being a boy wonder to becoming his own man. All of these great contributions were made by Mr. Perez, who also, as he was working at DC Comics, also was the creator of Lex Luthor's legendary powered armor. That armor you see him wearing in the Superpowers action figures, and that has been duplicated in numerous action figures and numerous series. That was a creation of George Perez when he was working on Superman, and again, that's another iconic part of that character that many people take for granted, but don't know that George Perez had a hand in it. Now, as George Perez worked at DC on his legendary run on the New Teen Titans, and I believe Teen Titans ended in issue 40 and they started a new Teen Titans series with somebody else, George then went on to do Crisis of Infinite Earths. Now, Crisis of Infinite Earths, this was a showcase for George's legendary style, and we got to see the biggest and grandest visuals in this 12-issue event. In this I believe that this is one of your signature pieces for George Perez as related to his art. When you think of George Perez's art, Crisis of Infinite Earths is considered to be, as I see it, the hallmark for his signature work, because his work on Crisis of Infinite Earths practically gave us a 12-issue series that featured almost every character in the DC universe, and we got to see all of these heroes in amazing detail in these big epic panels. And it was just, when you look at those panels and you really think about the amount of labor that went into those panels, I mean, it just shows how much of a master your George Perez was to the craft of comics, and how much of a master he was to the medium of comics. I mean, when I think about Crisis of Infinite Earths, it's like looking at a great painting from one of the legendary masters from the earlier centuries. I mean, like your Michelangelos or your Rembrandts or one of these other great artists. When you look at those panels in the Crisis of Infinite Earths, I mean, they just are just so powerful, and they evoke so much emotion. That's another reason why I like George Perez's art, and I just became a huge fan of it, is that in those big panels with all of that incredible detail, you can just feel all of the emotion. You can feel all of the energy, and you can just feel those scenes coming to life. And it's just so big and dynamic that there is not that you just are just floored by the amazing amount of detail that are put in those panels. So when I look at Crisis of Infinite Earths, I mean that is one of again his signature works, and it will be the one that I believe he will be remembered for long after he has left this world. And another work that George Perez, I believe, he will be remembered for is his run on Wonder Woman after Crisis of Infinite Earths. Now, this run practically revolutionized the Wonder Woman character and gave us many of the parts of her lore that we still follow today. When we look at that Wonder Woman run, again, it's an amazing run of comics that have feet that fuse Greek mythology and make it contemporary and fresh. And George's art just, it pops off the page, and he'll also be remembered for all of that, again, great art. And I believe he had a hand in helping to recreate the Barbara Minerva Cheetah, who was another character he will have, I believe, should get credit for, along with Deathstroke, Nightwing, the Taskmaster, just so many great characters he helped contribute to creating. And Mr. Perez's career, I mean, it was just amazing. With Wonder Woman would be amazing. But after that, he also worked on Action Comics and did another Superman run. And that Superman run featured Maxima. And it also gave us, I believe, Matrix, who became Supergirl. So a lot of great comics came from George Perez, in addition to him doing covers for one of the greatest comic storylines of the 1980s on New Titans and Batman. That was A Lonely Place of Dying. And I have those comics in my collection. And I got to see him do the covers for A Lonely... I bought them off the newsstand that featured the with Tim Drake and Batman on New Titans and on Batman. I got to buy those off the newsstand, and that was something that I took for granted when I was a teenager. But now that I'm hearing about George being in his last days, I really appreciate the opportunity to be able to have picked up those comics and experienced them in hand and at the newsstand. I mean, those comics, people take that for granted, the ability to go to the newsstand, but you don't really appreciate great artists until they are about to leave this earth. But that was something that it means a lot to me to be able to have gone out and picked up those books straight off the newsstand. So when I think about it, again, that was it resonates with me. And I picked up a lot of George Perez books as I was in high school, like A Lonely Place of Dying and Batman Year 3, which features some beautiful George Perez covers. And I also picked up The Infinity Gauntlet, which is another book that your George Perez I believe will be considered another signature work as related to his career, along with Crisis of Infinite Earths, New Teen Titans, and Wonder Woman. I believe Infinity Gauntlet will also be known as one of his signature books. And another book that I think people will remember George for is Future Imperfect with the Hulk, because the visuals there, they are just really moving. When you think of incredibly moving visuals from Mr. Perez, you have to really talk about Future Imperfect. Future Imperfect, I mean, when you look at the scene of Rick Jones inside of that place that has all of the heroes' fallen memorabilia, I mean, that is one of the most emotional pick visuals. I mean, I remember being in Jim Hanley's universe, flipping through Future Imperfect, and just being mortified seeing all of those relics from the bygone era sitting there broken and shattered and damaged and destroyed. And I mean, the visuals there, I mean, they were just really, really moving. And he captured all of that emotion from just inanimate objects and made us really understand that these objects, they had meaning in another time, and when we see them all broken, shattered, and destroyed, it floors you when you see that scene inside of that what people call the Maestro's trophy room, but it was a place where Rick Jones was staying, and it basically it when you see that double page spread, it will just jar you at first, and then you'll just be like you're mourning the loss of all of these heroes, and understanding how much this means to you, because you remember seeing all those heroes alive and participating in adventures, and then you see all of these relics of them lying there broken and shattered. I mean, that double page spread right there, I mean, that one is it's just one of the most moving panels I have ever experienced as related to comics. And the other one that I would think that would again resonate with me would be the death of the Flash. I mean, if you read that series of panels where Barry Allen just gives his life to save the universe, I mean, those panels just have so much emotion that you when you experience them, and especially when you experience them in the floppy format, it's just something to behold. I mean, it's just the emotions you'll feel from those scenes is just incredible, because again, these characters, they were a part of everybody's life, and then you just see them like that. It just stays with you. So that's the power of George Perez's art, and his art, it just stays with you. I mean, and that's why he's considered a legend. And as the 90s went on, George went to work for the company. I can't remember the name of it. They made Malibu Comics. They made Ultra Force, and George did some work there. And then he came back to Marvel, and he did another legendary run of Avengers. So he had two runs on Avengers, and I'd have to say his second run on Avengers was very strong, because storylines that he did, like the Count Nefarious storyline, the what I consider the greatest Ultron storyline, Ultron Unlimited. I mean, these were some absolutely fantastic comics, and I really was glad to have experienced a lot of them, because that second run on Avengers reintroduced George's art to another generation of comic fans, and it showed us that he could continue to make grand and epic visuals. Now, as George's career went on into the 2000s, he continued to do I mean, well, before I'm going to go back, before I go into the 2000s, because George did work on a Teen Titans series that I believe is extremely underrated. I know a lot of people don't like the Teen Titans series from the mid-90s that featured Argent and Johto and Risk, but it was a very solid, well-done series, and I think it's an underrated work from him and Dan Jurgens, and it doesn't really get the respect it deserves. But when I read that run, the writing was very solid, the character development was solid, but it didn't get over because that most comic fans wanted to see the Teen Titans that featured DC sidekicks. But these characters, when I look at them from a creative standpoint, they were very well developed. And George, his art, he did finishes on this. Dan did the art, but the finishes were from George, and they really popped. And it's an underrated series that deserves a bit more respect, and those characters deserve a bit more respect than many fans give them. Now, George also went on to do work for CrossGen. I didn't read many of those books, and then he went on to do some more work for DC, and he also did books like JLA Avengers, and he also later on did books like Siren. So George has had a great career going on into the 2000s, and he was continuing to go on until he started having some health issues, first with his eyes, then he had some heart issues, and then sadly, tragically, he wound up being diagnosed this week with stage 3 pancreatic cancer. And instead of him going through dealing with hospital bureaucracy, he has decided to dedicate himself to going out here and sharing his last days with the fans. And that is something that really shows how much character George has, because it takes a great man to go out here and share his last days with all of the comic fans out here. Now, I recently had a family member who passed away due to ovarian cancer, and I can tell you from experience that it's a very hard thing to experience. I mean, and for George to go out here and say, "I'm going to share my last days with you," that's a lot of love coming from him, because he really is, again, putting himself out there because he loves comic fans and he loves you guys so much that he's going to go out here and take the last days of his life and dedicate it to sharing it with everyone. So everybody should really appreciate, Mr. Perez for taking the time out of the last days of his life to share it with everybody out here who was a comic fan, because he could easily just go home and just stay with his family, but instead he wants to continue to give love to all the comic fans out here. And that again shows how much great character George Perez has to go out here and say, "I'm going to go out here in my last days and just go out here and continue to give to comic fans and give you guys a signature," because right now he's at a point where he can't draw anymore, and he's willing to just go out here and do signatures at cons. And everybody out here should really appreciate Mr. Perez taking the time to come out here and spend it with all of us. I mean, again, these are his last days as related to his life, and he's giving us the last days of his life to share with him. And again, that is a lot of love coming from a man who loves this comic medium and has a lot of heart for this comic medium. So when I think of George Perez, again, he's a legendary artist and a legendary icon, and I would consider him to be a truly great man, and I would consider him to be truly great because of the amazing character he has shown as related to his struggles with his health and his love for all of us comic fans out here, and willing to share his last days with us so that we can see how great his art is and see how great he is as a person. And again, when I think of George Perez, again, one of the great all-time comic artists of all time, and he will always, as I see it, be someone I will always appreciate and love, because if it wasn't for his comics, I would have never learned how to read, and if it wasn't for his comics, I would not have become a lifelong comic fan. George Perez's comics practically were my gateway to reading, along with the books of legendary artists like your Stan Lee, your Jack Kirby, David Michelini, Bob Layton, and many others. But when I think of the guy who was the gateway for me to being a comic fan, it was George Perez, and I believe I was blessed to have had to experience his comics firsthand inside of a floppy 32-page book, because to experience it like that is there's no other experience than that. Because yes, comics in reprint are good, but there's nothing like experiencing George Perez's art when you take it straight off the newsstand and you actually own the comics that are made of newsprint and have them in your collection. There's nothing like that. And to have experienced one of the greatest artists of the greatest medium in the actual medium, that I believe was a great blessing. And again, I'm glad that George Perez was a part of this medium, and I'm glad that God blessed us all to have experienced his great art. And I know that, again, he truly is somebody that I have great respect for. And I'm sorry to hear about his diagnosis as related to his health, but I really appreciate everything he has done in this comic medium, and I really appreciate everything he has contributed to this comic medium. and I'm sorry that he is going to has this terminal diagnosis, but I'm hoping people will appreciate how great a man he is, and if he passes, we all go out here and appreciate and preserve his legacy. Um, that's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe. Now available in paperback and e-readers, E-Steam Blast from the Past. Hell's aspiring angel takes on her demonic doppelganger in this action-packed, time-traveling E-Steam series adventure. Get E-Steam Blast from the Past with a bonus E-Steam comic book, No Good Deed, in paperback and e-readers at online booksellers everywhere.